get started. Thank you all for joining us at your noon hour today for our next emerging issues conversation, sponsored by the California Immunization Coalition and the American Academy of Pediatrics in California. Next slide. So a few housekeeping items for today. So all of our lines are muted during the program. But we are going to ask a lot of questions to Dr. O'Leary. So please use the question and answer box, and we will hopefully get to many of those questions during our conversation. And then the webinar will be recorded and we posted to the California Immunization Coalition website, as well as our YouTube site, which is constantly updated. Our YouTube site also has all of our previous conversations. For those of you who've been with us for a while, California Immunization Coalition for the last 3 years has been doing these webinars primarily around COVID, and we did monthly webinars during the heart of the COVID pandemic. And then we're doing periodic ones now as new issues come up with regards to vaccines and infectious disease. Next. So the sponsors of today's webinar are the California Immunization Coalition. We are a nonprofit public-private partnership seeking to increase immunization protection of all Californians. And we also are sponsored by the American Academy of Pediatrics in California. Next. And here are our hosts and moderators. So I am Eric Ball. I'm a primary care pediatrician with the CHOC Primary Care Network. I'm the current vice chair of the AAP in California. And I'm the co-chair of the Emerging Issues Committee with the California Immunization Coalition. And I'm joined by Dr. Pia Pannaraj, who's a professor of pediatrics, Division of Infectious Disease at UCSD and Rady Children's Hospital. She's director of the Pediatric Immunization Advancement Laboratory, or PIA Lab, cleverly named. And she's the current vice president of the California Immunization Coalition and my co-chair with the Emerging Issues Committee. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Pannaraj.
Great. Well, I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Sean O'Leary. We thank him very much for being with us despite his very busy schedule. He is the AAP liaison to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, as well as the current chair of the AAP Red Book Committee. His day job is professor of pediatrics at the University of Colorado and the Children's Hospital Colorado. And he also actually worked as a primary care physician for many years before becoming an ID specialist. His ongoing research focuses on prevention of vaccine-preventable diseases through understanding clinical, attitudinal, and infrastructural barriers to vaccination, and then developing and testing interventions to address those barriers. So thank you for joining us today. I thought we could just get started with you telling us about, maybe give us an overview of what the 3 new RSV products that are coming out.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pia, and really happy to be here. So yeah, very exciting times. I'll start with the one that I think will be most directly impactful for pediatricians right now, which is Nirsevimab. So Nirsevimab is a monoclonal antibody, which you may be aware that Synagis or palivizumab is a monoclonal antibody that we've used for decades to prevent RSV. Nirsevimab is similar, but I'll just say a lot better. So it appears, at least in the clinical trials, appeared to work better in terms of prevention of disease and hospitalization than palivizumab, and it also lasts a lot longer. So a single dose is designed to protect infants through the respiratory season. So this product was licensed by the FDA in July, recommended by ACIP in August, and I guess earlier, August. And it is being ordered, and my understanding is getting delivered here right now. So lots of issues around this product that we can cover in the Q&A, but just so we're clear on the recommendation, it is recommended for all infants. So I'm continually surprised that more of us pediatricians haven't heard that fact. A lot of people think it's just replacing Synagis. No, this is for all newborns up to 8 months of age. The recommendation, and this is there's loose language around the seasonality, but the recommendation is for all infants less than 8 months of age during or entering their first RSV season. So for infants born October to March, the recommendation is to get it either in the hospital at delivery or shortly thereafter, within a week, in an outpatient setting. For infants born April through September, the recommendation is to get the product at a regular well child visit and like during the RSV season. So starting in September, October, something like that. That seasonality, as I mentioned, sometimes varies by with geography. It often comes earlier in parts of in tropical climates, and then parts of the South, like Florida and Georgia. And Alaska tends to have a longer season. So those are so there's some flexibility built into the recommendation in terms of when exactly you start and stop giving this product. For the second year of life, it is recommended for essentially the same children for whom Synagis is recommended. So for kids 8 to 19 months of age entering their second RSV season, who have high-risk conditions. So that would mean, for example, chronic lung disease, still on oxygen. That would mean severe immunocompromised, severe cystic fibrosis. So a fairly limited set of patients for whom it's recommended, but the addition, so different than Synagis, the addition for that second year of life is for American Indian and Alaska Native children are also supposed to get this product in the second year of life. And the reasoning for that was that there's a 4 to 10-fold increased risk compared to healthy infants of American Indian and Alaska Natives for hospitalization from RSV. And it's also recognized that in a lot of American Indian reservations, distance to medical care is quite far. And so often involving helicopters, airplanes to get kids to get a place where they can get oxygen. So prevention is especially key in American Indian and Alaska Native children. So that's the recommendation for Nirsevimab. I will quickly mention there's a maternal vaccine that FDA approved last month that is being discussed by ACIP tomorrow. So ACIP can make, so recommendations from ACIP can take one of three forms. They can recommend the intervention. They can recommend for routine use. They can recommend the intervention for shared clinical decision-making, which we all love. That was sarcasm. Or they can recommend a vaccine, or they can not recommend the vaccine. I personally expect that they will probably recommend it, but it could go the direction of the shared clinical decision-making recommendation for a few reasons that we can talk about as we get further into the discussion. But I expect it's probably going to be a routine recommendation. If that happens, there will be guidance coming from CDC and AAP on how do we handle that, because you could say, okay, well, wait a minute, now we have one product for RSV and all of a sudden we have two for the same season. Do we use them both? Based on discussions at the June meeting from ACIP, looking at cost effectiveness analyses, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to give both to a single infant. So for example, if the pregnant person gets the maternal vaccine and it's a healthy term newborn, then Nirsevimab would not be recommended. Conversely, if they didn't get it, then Nirsevimab would be recommended. That's probably the guidance that will come out from CDC, assuming this gets recommended. And we can talk more about that. And then the other products are for 60 and over, and those are shared clinical decision-making recommendations. So those are RSV vaccines. The reasoning behind the shared clinical decision-making recommendation in 60 and older is that it was recognized that a healthy 65-year-old is not actually at very high risk of severe disease from RSV, very low risk for hospitalization, as opposed to an 85-year-old who is at quite high risk. Now, why didn't they just make a risk-based recommendation instead of shared clinical decision-making recommendation? Risk-based recommendations historically don't work. When we've historically had risk-based recommendations, very few people in the targeted risk group end up getting the actual product. So then you say, well, why didn't they just make a routine recommendation? And the routine recommendation was due to some potential safety issues that we can talk about. That it's not clear if they're real, but the clinical trials just can't be large enough for these potential rare adverse events to determine if they're real or not. So they were hesitant to make a full recommendation for all individuals because of the potential risk of these rare adverse events. So why don't I stop there? That's kind of a general overview, and we can get into some of the questions.
I appreciate the overview. I think as we were talking about the two newer vaccines for older populations, I'm a pediatrician, and I think of RSV as being a disease of babies and preemies. And, in my mind, anyone over 2 who gets RSV just gets a cold. So what is the burden of disease for our older population, and, why do they need a vaccine?
Yeah. Sorry, I should have started with that. Very good question. So, it was news to me several years ago, actually, about the level of the burden of RSV disease in older adults. I was also under the impression, what I learned in medical school and residency was it's a disease of infants. And then as you get older, it's just a bad cold. But that's actually not true. In older adults, the rate, depending on the study you look at and the data source you look at, the burden is in many studies approaches that of influenza, and in some cases equals influenza, depending on the study you look at. So quite high burden of disease, tens of thousands of hospitalizations every year from RSV, thousands of deaths. So there is a significant burden. Again, most of those are in adults who are not 65 and older, but more like 75, 85 and older. Big problem in long-term care facilities, nursing homes, et cetera. Younger older adults, say 60, 65, et cetera, if they have chronic medical conditions, which many of them do, then it is also high risk for those individuals as well.
Let's stay on the vaccine for those over 60 for just a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about shared decision-making and what that means for the provider?
Yeah. So for the pediatricians in the audience, you're familiar with shared clinical decision-making because we have it for Men-B vaccine. It's also for the family docs in the audience. There's a shared clinical decision-making recommendation for HPV vaccine for ages 27 to 45. And we have, and there used to be shared clinical decision-making around pneumococcal vaccines as well. Anyway, it's one of those recommendations that has evolved over the years from the perspective of ACIP. So there used to be what they called permissive recommendations. So, basically you can use it if you want to, was sort of the message. Then they had these category A, category B recommendations, and category B fit into what they called shared, or what we now call shared clinical decision-making. So what that means is that there's not really a compelling case from a public health perspective to recommend this vaccine for an entire group, to recommend a particular vaccine for an entire group. There may, however, be benefit for certain individuals. And so what ACIP is essentially telling the clinicians is have this conversation with the patients you take care of. Now, for some things, I think, frankly, for these RSV products, that may be more straightforward than, for example, for Men-B. So for the RSV products, I think that the clinicians who take care of these patients can say, like, you're 88, you're at high risk of disease. I think this is a good idea for you, but let's talk about it. They could say this to a 65-year-old healthy patient. We have this product. If you're interested, we can give it, but you're actually not at very high risk of disease. So it's kind of up to you. So those would be examples of conversations. I think Men-B is trickier because, we're talking about a conversation with everyone where they're for the most part in the same risk group. They're a little bit higher risk if you're leaving for college at that time. It does have a routine recommendation for high risk individuals, but for most healthy adolescents, it's a really tricky conversation. So honestly, in this case, I think it may be a little bit more straightforward for those adult providers.
I don't want to talk about business too much, but I find that with meningococcal type B vaccine, when we order it, it seems to get paid for by insurance companies. But we've been hearing from a lot of our colleagues in family medicine and internal medicine that because the current recommendation is shared clinical decision-making, and they use the word may instead of should in the guidelines, that for non-Medicare, a lot of them seem to be getting some pushback where these vaccines are not being paid for. Have you heard similar things?
Yeah, so and we can talk about that actually with Nirsevimab as well. And there's some issues around pneumococcal conjugate, the 20-valent pneumococcal conjugate vaccine too. But so that is actually a misinterpretation of the law. If a vaccine, per the Affordable Care Act, if a vaccine is recommended by ACIP in any fashion, whether it's a routine recommendation or risk-based recommendation or shared clinical decision-making, it must be paid for by payers within a year of the publication of the MMWR. So adult vaccine financing is challenging and it's somewhat different than pediatrics. There's no vaccines for adults program, whereas we have the vaccines for children program. CDC is really working on developing a vaccines for adults program with actually this bridge program for COVID-19 vaccines being sort of a first step down that path. But I don't want to speak, I can't speak very intelligently about, for example, Medicare Part D, Medicare Part B, and those types of things. But per the Affordable Care Act, if it's recommended under shared clinical decision-making, it should be covered, with the exception of these grandfathered plans for pre-ACA, which my understanding are not that common. That has come up actually. Well, I won't dive. We'll talk about it with Nirsevimab in a second, because that's become an issue that I spent most of my morning on.
One last question for the vaccine for adults before we move to Nirsevimab. Can you say, is there a preference for either GSK's vaccine or Pfizer's vaccine? And can you talk just a little bit about the side effects that were found during clinical?
Yeah. So there's no preference between the two. ACIP very rarely makes a preference for one vaccine over another if it's for the same condition. It has to be a really compelling difference in the products for them to do that. The most recent example would be the Shingrix vaccine over the old Zostavax vaccine, because the efficacy was just so clearly superior. So in this case, there is no preference in terms of the side effects. So most of the side effects are what you might see with any vaccine, fairly straightforward. There weren't big differences in vaccine recipients versus placebo in the clinical trials for many of the things we're talking about, like fatigue and that kind of thing. There's a little bit, of course, more fever, a little bit more redness at the site and soreness at the site, that kind of thing. But the big ones that we're most concerned about are neuroinflammatory conditions, sort of immune-mediated neuroinflammatory conditions, Guillain-Barré syndrome being the clearest example. And there were a handful of cases in these trials. Again, these trials were not powered to detect these rare adverse events and put any kind of precision on an estimate on like how likely is it to get one of these. There are vaccines, Shingrix being one of them, that based on large epidemiologic studies using systems like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, where it has been identified that there is a slightly increased risk on the order of a handful of cases per million doses type thing. With these, it's just not clear. It is possible that there is this potential for Guillain-Barré syndrome or other neuroinflammatory conditions after the vaccination, but it was one of those things that you can't design a trial large enough to really see if that's real. So the plan is to monitor that in post-licensure surveillance, both from the manufacturers as well as from our safety surveillance mechanisms here in the US.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to shift gears and, as a pediatrician, move to talking about babies. So we're going to talk probably for the lion's share of the noon hour, we're going to talk about Nirsevimab and monoclonal antibodies for babies. So I'll start very basic. So what is this? Is it a vaccine? And why isn't there a RSV vaccine for babies? Why are we using monoclonal antibodies instead?
Sure. Step back and give a little background. So in the 60s, there was an RSV vaccine that was developed in a manner similar to many other vaccines using the technology of the time, which was an inactivated vaccine. It was formaldehyde inactivated. They basically killed the virus and injected it. The problem with that vaccine in the 60s was that it actually increased risk of hospitalization in the infants who got the vaccine compared to those that got placebo. And in fact, there were a few deaths. And so it was not understood at the time why that happened. Since that time, it's the scientists have figured out, what they think went wrong there, and people have spent decades studying what went wrong there. But there's been a lot of hesitancy based on that experience to really dive into those waters of using an RSV vaccine. We're fairly certain we are past that issue. We now understand, based on decades of progress in immunology, et cetera, what happened there. So now where we are is there are a lot of products in the pipeline. If you're interested, you just Google PATH, P-A-T-H, and RSV. And I think the first thing that pops up, you can get a PDF snapshot of all the products in development. And there are vaccines for infants in the pipeline that we may be talking about in coming years. None for a few years, but there are some that are in clinical trials right now. We're in a little bit of a race for the prize situation here with RSV products, because company manufacturers and academic centers have been pursuing RSV products for a long time. And a lot of them are now reaching phase 3 clinical trials and getting into the place where we might actually see them coming into use. And now we have these, 3 products that are all, within a year of each other that are now available, right? And there are more. In terms of what we have right now for kids, why Nirsevimab and not a vaccine, I think, one of the things to consider is that this is the first monoclonal antibody that we're using for routine use in kids. We've used palivizumab, and we all struggled through the 5 doses for the high-risk kids, and that's always challenging. It's very expensive. Monoclonal antibodies have a lot of potential advantages for prevention of infectious disease. A lot of you are probably aware that much of the work with monoclonal antibodies has been going on for specific medical conditions, a lot of autoimmune conditions, for example, treatments for rheumatoid arthritis and other rheumatologic conditions. And that market has really exploded. But for infectious diseases, they have great potential. They can, particularly for things like pandemics, they can be manufactured much more quickly than traditional vaccines. And so they have a lot of advantages there. When we think about prevention of RSV in young infants, we think about our routine childhood vaccination schedule, right? Most of the vaccines we give at 2, 4, and 6 months, and then boosters at a year, and then start MMR and varicella. Those first, we see a lot of infants hospitalized in those first 2 months of life for RSV. The immune system at birth is, it's a little bit different. You're just born. You may not quite be ready for some of these products. They may not work as well. So that you have that window. Whereas with this product, you can give it the day the child is born, and they are protected essentially immediately from RSV. So I don't know if I said this yet or not. Is this a vaccine? It's not technically a vaccine, but it is an immunization. So when you think about immunization, most of what we do is active immunization with vaccines. What we're doing in this case is passive immunization by giving the antibody that fights the pathogen. In the same sense, maternal vaccination, so giving a pregnant person an RSV vaccine, that is passive immunization for the infant. So because the infant is being protected by passive antibody transfer through the placenta. So in a sense, these two approaches that we're going to have available for this season are very similar in terms of their mechanism of action.
How long does protection from Nirsevimab last? And are there, do we have any concerns about how the infant's immune system will respond to a natural RSV infection afterwards?
Yeah, good question. So It looks like it, so it's the clinical trials looked at different time points, but we know it has good protection through 6 months essentially after immunization, and it probably has some protection beyond that as well, because it's not like it's in there and then it's out. It's a slow, steady loss of this antibody. But so it's a very long-acting product, and that's one of the primary differences between it and palivizumab, is a single dose protects you ideally through the entire RSV season. In terms of your second question, this product is generally expected to prevent severe disease, lower respiratory tract infection, but probably not very good at protection from actual infection. So we expect that a lot of these infants who, and let me back up a second. Why is this an important question? Your first RSV infection tends to be your worst. And part of what we saw last year with the peak of RSV season being sort of in October, November, and just like historic levels of hospitalizations, was that we had a large cohort of children who had never seen RSV before. So it kind of shifted our curve of how old were the kids that were being hospitalized. And it wasn't because there was something about the virus that had changed. It was because a lot of those infants had just never seen RSV before. So in this case, we don't think that the same thing is going to happen, because they will have seen RSV. They just wouldn't, and have had a chance to have an immune response to it. They just won't have gotten severe disease from it. So we expect that that shouldn't be a problem with this product, but very important question.
So when this rolls into our office in a few weeks or what have you, we have a whole cohort of kids who are born in the summer and the spring and what have you. And it's going to be, a heavy lift for all of us to contact those patients and bring them in. I imagine we'll see a lot of them at their routine checkups. Can you give this immunization, this monoclonal antibody, with other vaccines? Can I give it with their 4-month shots?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no reason to think that this, so CDC, AAP recommend, yes, you can co-administer this product with other vaccines. And from a biologic standpoint, there really shouldn't be a reason to expect it would interfere with the immune response to the other vaccines. I also should say something about safety. It looked very safe in the clinical trials, and based on the biology of the product, I don't think any of us are really expecting any unexpected safety signals that we sometimes see with new products. This is a very relatively straightforward, simple, specific monoclonal antibody.
Can anybody give the monoclonal antibody? Are there any restrictions on who can administer it, like a medical assistant or pharmacist?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk about that, and just as background, the FDA, CDC is looking at this product as an immunization, essentially viewing it the same way as they view vaccines. So it's going to be in the immunization schedule. It's in the Vaccines for Children program. FDA classified this product as a therapeutic or drug and not a vaccine. And that carries with it a number of implications, one of which is what you're alluding to here, Pia, is in some jurisdictions in the US, medical assistants can give vaccines, but they can't give therapeutics. I heard there was a scan across the US to look at how big a problem that is, and it looks like it's a fairly uncommon problem. I actually don't know specifically about California. I know for here in Colorado, where I am, it's not a problem, and medical assistants will be able to administer this product. I suspect the same is true for you, but I haven't heard confirmation on that.
I want to start the business conversation with asking about hospitals. So I think ideally, kids would get this before they were discharged from the hospital, and it would be taken care of there and not in our offices. Word on the street is that's probably not going to happen for a variety of reasons, finances being probably the number one. But do you have any more information about, I think a lot of hospitals get bundled payments, right? They get a certain amount of money for the baby being in the hospital, regardless of what happens there. So they're reluctant to do this. Have you heard any information about whether that'll change, or is the burden going to be really shifted onto family docs and pediatricians in the community?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the elephant in the room. And just to be clear, what the cost of this product is. So what the manufacturer communicated as it was being developed and it was being discussed is they would price this product in line with other routine childhood vaccine series. And so what they, what that means is that it turns out it's the most expensive product we give in our among all the childhood immunizations that we give. Because, if you add up, for example, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, the 4 doses that are recommended for all children, it's actually more expensive than this product, but it's 4 doses. So this product is priced at $495 for the private market. That is for even a small pediatric practice, that's a huge potential expense right up front. And hospitals are no different. So that's really the issue here, is that this is a very expensive product relative to for something that we are giving to the entire birth cohort. And it's there's a lot of barriers right now that we're working through with this product. To me, that's the biggest one. So let's see. So from the perspective of the hospitals, I'll just tell you sort of what I'm hearing from some of the meetings I've been having here in Colorado and then with AAP and what I'm hearing through CDC as well, is that there are places that are doing it. So hospitals like my wife works at Denver Health, which is our big safety net system, serves like 60% of kids in Denver area, 4,000 deliveries a year. They're planning on doing it. They've got their VFC providers. They're purchasing their private stock for their privately insured patients, and they're going to do it. I've heard of other children's hospitals that are affiliated with delivery hospitals that are planning on doing it. I think my understanding is that our university hospital here is doing it. One of the big issues is that only roughly 10 to 12% of delivery hospitals in the US are VFC providers. So there's that. There hasn't been a big incentive for them to become VFC providers historically. So there's that issue. More than half of kids in the country are eligible for VFC. The second issue is that they are in the same boat as the general pediatrician. They may not get paid back. And so the bundle payment issue, at ACIP meetings, there was some discussion that HHS they were working on increasing the bundled payment. And to be clear, I guess there are different tiers of bundled payments that can happen. So for example, if they stocked and gave this product, it would be a different bundled payment than if they didn't. But I don't know I don't know where those discussions are. And I think hospitals are not reassured that they're magically just going to be paid back. So I think most hospitals right now are pushing back on delivering this product because of the potential cost. They can eat the cost of the hepatitis B vaccine. It's $13 to $15. I don't know of a hospital that could eat the cost of this product. So it's a big challenge. And the same is true of the general pediatricians. So well, let me stop there because we probably can talk a little bit more about the hospital issues.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We've heard the very same concerns from the general pediatricians and practices, just concerned about, the cost and that they won't be able to make it available to their patients unless insurance companies cover it. And so I'll let you comment further on that, but I do want to put out a message that our California Department of Public Health is very aware and appreciates these concerns, and they actually want to work to try to figure out a way to help this and actually want to gather a list so that they can advocate, a list of payers that are paying and not paying so that they can advocate for this. So I'm just going to put in a plug that we actually will have a post-webinar questionnaire as soon as this webinar ends. So if you are having these issues, please put your comments in there and call out the payer so that we can tabulate that list for our California Department of Public Health. So
Another thing I'll say about that issue is National AAP is advocating here in Colorado, our Immunization Coalition, Colorado AAP. We are advocating. We're talking to the payers. We need this product covered. There have been assurances. I haven't seen any dollar amounts in terms of what they would pay back, but I have heard from some of the payers that yes, we will cover this product. One thing I'm suggesting for the private practices is get your parents engaged. If you have parents that are coming and wanting this product and you can't buy and you don't know if you're going to get paid for it, have them call their insurance company. Because if they're hearing from a lot of their families that they want this product paid for, that might move some of them to go ahead and stop dragging their feet and do it. From the perspective of the payer, one, they're going to be required to cover it, but two, there will be some return on investment from the perspective of the payer, because often if they're paying it for the infant, it's then covered, that they're preventing something that they would end up paying for, which is the hospitalization, which I think they obviously recognize is quite expensive. So there is some return on investment from the perspective, purely the economic perspective of the payers. Forget about the fact that it's the right thing to do to prevent disease in infants. They need to look at their economic bottom line, and actually there probably is some benefit to them. So one of the big issues that I've been hearing pushback on, and I don't think this was in the questions we discussed, so I'll just bring it up, but that some clinicians are getting pushback from the payers because it's not on the schedule. And so actually in tomorrow's meeting, I just noticed it was added to the agenda that they will be planning not just for this product, but for the 60 and over products and potentially the maternal vaccine, if it's recommended, an addendum to the existing schedule so that is no longer a defense from these payers. That yes, it is in the schedule here. Look, to us, it's kind of self-evident. ACIP recommends it. It's published in the MMWR. It's in the schedule because the actual schedule is voted on every October, published every February by CDC, and it's static at that point. So I think what CDC is looking to do is make it a more dynamic schedule so that you can't get that resistance from payers. Now, the other big issue, of course, is that payers do have up to a year by law after it's published in the MMWR to cover these products. And so they can drag their feet on that. But I think, we've seen historically with other products that, some of the payers are really good about paying right away and others continue to drag their feet. But the more we can advocate, I think the better off we'll be.
Since I just took over your seat on the schedule, ACIP schedule group.
Yeah. You've been discussing this. Yeah.
That's right. I just saw a draft of that addendum for the schedule come across my desk about 10 minutes before this webinar started. Yeah. So it's active and working.
I want to save you from further business talk. So let's go back to medicine. There's been a lot of amazing questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to run through some of those. So really good question. This actually just happened to me. I just had a 4-month-old well check for a kid who was hospitalized. It wasn't hospitalized, but had RSV like a month ago, like some weird off-season RSV. So does that kid get this medication, or because he had RSV, is he good now?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and this is different than the Polovizumab or Synagis recommendations, where we said if they get RSV, you stop it. So now the recommendation actually is ignore any RSV history. And I just put up in the chat CDC guidance that was just released this morning, where it states that clearly, that because there are a number of reasons for that. One is that we don't want to encourage unnecessary testing, respiratory virus testing, to determine eligibility for a product, right? That gets really complicated and leads into all kinds of unintended consequences. But more importantly, those kids are still at potential risk for hospitalization. Their risk has gone down, but it's still there and it can be prevented. So the recommendation is still to go ahead and give it, even if you knew they had RSV, if they're under 8 months of age.
Right. Previous Polovizumab recommendations were up to 24 months. But the new guidelines for Nirsevimab are up to 19 months. So what do we do with those high-risk cardiac patients or pulmonary patients who previously would have gotten palivizumab, but now are not in the correct age group? Or if
Yeah. So this is tricky, but let me just walk you through a thought exercise. So infant born February of 2021, that's in their first RSV season. They get their high risk, whatever, palivizumab. They go into the fall of 2021, winter 2021, 2022, second RSV season. Okay. Now they're at 20 months of age, entering their third RSV season. So the likelihood is those kids have probably had RSV once, at least once, probably twice. Their airways are bigger. So that's actually for them their third RSV season. And so that's the reason why they made this cutoff. Now, are there specific certain infants who may benefit? Because the FDA indication is actually to 24 months. The ACIP recommendation is to 19. Are there certain infants who might benefit? The ones I'm thinking about are, for example, the 20-month-old who is diagnosed with leukemia and needs a BMT at 22 months of age and they have no immune system. Might that child benefit? Yeah, I think that child would probably benefit. But and BMT doctors, for example, may make the decision in those rare cases to go ahead and give it, even though there's a good chance they're not going to get paid back, just because the morbidity of RSV in that child is so high. But from a public health standpoint, from a population standpoint, I think the need in that 20 to 24 month age group is going to be pretty narrow. It's going to be a pretty small group of infants for whom that would benefit. So I think it sounds like a big problem, but I don't actually think it's as big a problem as when I first looked at it.
Is there a specified group of children who should receive Nirsevimab in their second season? Is it prescribed or is it?
It's prescribed. Yeah. Okay. So in that second season, it's severe. It's lung disease, still on some kind of therapy. So be it oxygen or a diuretic or something like that. Severe immunocompromised, and that is not defined. And that was never defined for palivizumab either. And it's I think the clinicians who are taking care of those kids know who they are. These are kids who are generally going to be taken care of by subspecialists. So we're not talking about a 5-day burst of steroids or something like that. We're talking about like bone marrow transplant, leukemia, those types of things. And then severe CF would be another category. And then, as I mentioned, the American Indian Alaska Native.
So my patient is an ex-preemie and has some residual lung issues and is on like Pulmicort. That kid would not get it.
I don't. Let me double check. I don't think Pulmicort would qualify, but I will look at the wording of the recommendation. Yeah. I may be wrong about that.
And you mentioned Alaska Natives and American Indian. Can you talk about why they were added to the recommendation for Nirsevimab?
Yeah, so we've known for a while that American Indian Alaska Native children were at higher risk for RSV disease, hospitalization, and but more recent studies have shown how high how much higher that risk is. So 5 to 10 times. So when we looked at for example, when we looked at the cost effectiveness analyses for what makes sense in terms of because you could give a product like this to everyone and it might keep us from getting a runny nose, but that's not a good use of resources. So there's always these considerations of how do we best use these resources. And so when we looked at the resource use, it seemed to be that it was somewhat cost effective, if not cost saving, to use this product in children that were 5 to 10 times higher risk than the average infant. And so that's what we have seen in recent studies with American Indian Alaska Native children, is that they are at much higher risk, probably from from circumstance, living in crowded conditions, living on reservations, many of which, a lot of our American Indian population are living in places with no running water. So there are very crowded homes, and oftentimes very far from medical care. And so, for example, particularly in places like Alaska. So that was the reasoning behind that recommendation. Now, could that have been teased out more about, well, what if it's a kid living in a city and they're healthy and they know it, well, okay, yeah, maybe that child isn't as high risk, but it gets very complicated to try and parse down these individual recommendations. So the decision was made to make it for all children who are classified as American Indian and Alaska Native.
I feel like we could talk all day about Nirsevimab, and we have so many great questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to transition to talking about vaccine for pregnant people for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're out of time. So the question from the Q&A, which I thought was a great question, is we as pediatricians have gotten really good at talking to vaccine hesitant families about vaccines, and we know how to explain the immune system to them. This is a completely different product. And do you suspect there's going to be, Nirsevimab hesitancy? And do you have any talking points or ideas of how we should talk to families about this, as it is a little bit different than a vaccine?
Yes, I will talk about that, but let me go back. I just looked, and I think your patient on Pulmicort probably that would qualify because it's on medical therapy. But that doesn't mean every child who's on Pulmicort for asthma or whatever qualifies. It's chronic lung disease of prematurity. Okay, so I think with this product, I think you, Pia, you mentioned at the top that a lot of the work I do is around immunization delivery, and I do a lot of work in the world of vaccine hesitancy. And so I've been thinking about this all along. And one thing I can say is it's impossible to predict with any accuracy. I can give you some general thoughts about what I think is going to happen, but the way things land on parents and the general public really varies. Or really is hard to predict, I should say. So my best guess is that you will have somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on your patient population, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30% of families who are like begging you to give them this product. And then you will have a good segment of your patients who have never heard of this product. But if you say, you know what, I am really excited about this product. It's the first time this is the leading cause of hospitalization in children, and now we have something to prevent it. I'm really excited about it. They're going to say, sure. And then you're going to have a segment, and this is probably, in some clinics, it might be 5%. In some clinics, it might be 50% of the families who are going to say, I don't know about this. It's new. Yeah, I don't think so. Or they may just want to hear more about it, have an extended conversation with you about it. So I think you're going to see a range. I think we can predict that. I can't predict what the uptake is going to be this year. I don't really see. I actually see it as one of the biggest concerns among parents who delay or refuse vaccines is vaccine safety. I think I am comfortable with, based on the clinical trials, and I think as pediatricians, you all could I think, as you look into it further and read more about it, I think you can also get comfortable that this is a very safe product. We predict it to be a very safe product, and I think we can be reassuring in that sense that even though it's new, we've given a very similar product for 20 years. That we have really, that has been studied for safety, and we really have not seen any unanticipated safety concerns based on what we know about how this monoclonal antibody works. We wouldn't expect any unanticipated safety concerns. So I really see a big upside and very little downside with this product. Now, we could do a whole session. A lot of what I do is teaching people how to communicate using motivational interviewing. We could talk for an hour about the different techniques there, but we have other resources for that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We will invite you back for that next webinar. Great. I thought we should make a little shift because we're getting closer to the end of the hour and want a chance to talk about the new vaccine approved for pregnant women. So can you tell us about that and who should get the vaccine?
Yeah, so that's what's going to be decided tomorrow at ACIP. So FDA licensed it for pregnant persons 32 to 36 weeks gestation. Okay, so let me give you a little background there. And I'm going to have to use some manufacturers' names here just so there's clarity. So there's a company called GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, that had a maternal vaccine that not identical, but very similar to the one that is currently before ACIP, which is manufactured by Pfizer. So again, similar but not identical. They both are vaccines that target the the prefusion protein on the RSV virus. And essentially the same target. That GSK product was the clinical trial was halted and ended. The GSK has abandoned that product for use in pregnancy because of what appears to be an increased risk of premature delivery in pregnant people who got the vaccine. That was seen primarily in the GSK trial in low and middle income countries. It was not really seen here in the US. And the difference was fairly striking in terms of the level, the percentage of prematurity. To be clear, both of these were in healthy pregnant populations. So singleton pregnancies, no high risk pregnancies. These were healthy pregnancies. For the Pfizer product, there was not a statistically significant difference in prematurity between the vaccine group and the control group, but there was a 1% non-statistically significant difference. I think it was 5.7% in the group that got the vaccine compared to 4.7% prematurity in the group that got the placebo. Now, note, for those neonatologists in the audience, that's a lower level of prematurity than the general population, right? So this was a healthy population. Where this was seen in the Pfizer trial was in primarily in South Africa, and where the imbalance was fairly clear. I think it was like 8% to 4% or something like that. We really do not know, one, if these were real. So the GSK is far enough that I think people are pretty suspicious it's real, but we don't know why. In Pfizer, it may not be real. But that's the concern, is this maternal vaccine going to induce prematurity? So the reason that the FDA went ahead and made the license it for 32 to 36 weeks is that essentially hedging bets. If it could potentially trigger prematurity, I don't think if they thought it was real, I don't think they would have licensed it. Right. I think they would have said, no, prematurity is, that's a non-starter. So I can't speak for FDA. That's just my guess. 32 to 36 weeks. If it turned out that this was real in post-marketing surveillance, at least any prematurity you induced is late preterms, which still have some morbidity, but generally much better than, say, a 25-weeker. The things that point away from this being a real signal, there are several things pointing away. One is the difference in prematurity was noted more than 30 days after the vaccine was given. And so it's not clear what the biologic plausibility would be there. It's not reactogenicity around the vaccine. And then, of course, that we didn't see it at all in the US. There was also concern about how prematurity was defined. Maybe perhaps there was a difference. They were paying more attention to the intervention group. I don't know. There was that, and the other thing is these signals were noted during a time of high COVID circulation. So there are all of these things that may have confounded this. So we don't really know if it's real, but that's why they recommended it 32 to 36 weeks, was to avoid that potential complication. So that's when it's supposed to be given. Again, assuming that ACIP recommends it tomorrow. The recommendation would probably be for all pregnant people. If and then the next question becomes, well, what the heck? Which one do we give? And that's a real challenge. I think this is an unprecedented situation. We've never encountered this situation before where a vaccine that's given in pregnancy affects an immunization we give to the child, because probably what ACIP will recommend is not to give both to individual infants. So, essentially the burden is going to be on the OBGYN clinicians and the nurse midwives and family docs who are delivering babies to have these conversations with their patients and say, well, we have these two products. Here's one option. Here's the other option. But we know historically that obstetricians are not terribly interested in talking about pediatric vaccines. They don't feel trained to do so. They're not sure how to answer questions. So this would be asking a lot of our obstetrical colleagues. So I don't know what's going to happen in terms of how these are rolled out. I'm very excited. Well, I'm excited that we're going to have these products. The implementation is going to be bumpy under any circumstances, and the two products at once, give one but not both, that's going to be really challenging.
I imagine when babies come into our office for their first visit, there'll be a checklist we'll do. Like, did the mother get the vaccine? Yes, no. Did the baby get Nirsevimab in the hospital? Yes, no. Yeah. And if it's no to both of those, then we do it, I imagine, right?
It's a solvable problem. I think, we get, as was mentioned, I was a general pediatrician for a long time. I did a lot of hospital medicine, and I did a lot of neonatology in our nursery. And so I would always review those records, and we would see hepatitis B surface antigen negative, rubella immune, RPR non-reactive, et cetera. And you could imagine that this could be built into a similar field, so that the clinician taking care of the infant has that information just as they have the rest of this. So it's a solvable problem in terms of a data issue, but it'll be a little bit bumpy this year, and people are working out how to work that out.
I'm gonna have Pia close, but before I do, I wanted to give a plug. As you guys can see, Dr. O'Leary is an amazing speaker and educator, and he's going to be one of our featured speakers this year at the American Academy of Pediatrics Las Vegas seminars, which is held December 7th to the 10th at Caesar's Palace. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, including Dr. O'Leary. He's going to talk about vaccine hesitancy, motivational interviewing, among other things there. So I'm hoping you guys can join us. I included the link to our registration, and it's a great weekend of education and, frankly, a lot of fun too. So thank you, Dr. O'Leary, for joining us for that and for today. And I'll let Pia close.
Yeah. And before I close, I just want to tell everybody, don't jump off quite yet, because we want you to fill out that questionnaire afterwards to tell us about the issues that you're having, so we can help get those fixed. But I do want to thank very much Dr. O'Leary for joining us today and for helping us go through some of these questions and answers, especially since this is so new and we're all trying to figure out how to make it work. But how exciting it is to have these, 3 new products, all for RSV. And I will set out that reminder that just popped up on the slide, that don't forget to vaccinate the kids and everybody else for both flu and COVID. That's still the best way to protect them. Right, there's the reminder for the questionnaire. Next slide, that we do keep, stay tuned for future conversations, and we do have all of these online on our YouTube channel, and this will also be there as well for the future. So thank you very much for joining us today. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. I really enjoyed being here.